On the evening of November 13, 2015, Paris was shaken by a series of coordinated attacks. 129 people were killed, hundreds more wounded. An ambience of fear gripped the country. Terrorists could strike anywhere, at any time. Nothing was safe. Even the smallest venue could be targeted. It might be tempting to react to this event emotionally without looking beyond the official narrative, without examining the evidence, without questioning where this is headed. You wouldn't be alone. But blind indignation lends itself to easy answers, half-truths and comforting lies. Anytime a population is attacked, or believes that they have been attacked by an outside force, the reaction is as predictable as it is dangerous. New wars and totalitarian laws that would have been unthinkable days before are easily justified. Voices of reason are drowned out, and entire nations can be driven towards a cliff. Given the nature of this particular cliff, it would behoove you to look a little deeper this time. There are several moving parts in this story: the Syrian war, ISIS and the push to remove Assad from power, the expansion of a militarized police state throughout Europe, and of course the refugee crisis, all of which has been conveniently tied together by a passport carried by a suicide bomber, a passport which miraculously survived the blast unscathed. Never mind the fact that German Interior Minister Thomas de Maizière came forward to say that he had reason to suspect that the passport had been planted. Let's deconstruct this one piece at a time. Evidence of foreknowledge without even looking beyond mainstream sources. We find evidence that the French government knew that the attacks were coming. They were warned by the Iraqi government. They were warned by the Turkish government twice. And according to this article from the Times of Israel, which has since been edited, security officials in Paris were specifically warned of an impending attack that very morning. The same article goes on to mention that the Bataclan theater had financial ties to the Israeli military. And of course the French government just happened to be running an exercise simulating a mass shooting in Paris just hours before the attacks began. Where have we seen that before? Could someone please explain how Iraq and the Turkey government, which are developing countries, were able to see this coming, while the NSA and French intelligence were caught completely off guard? Are we really to believe that this was just incompetence? The setup before the dust had even settled. The official narrative was clear. ISIS was responsible. This was war, and France was going to escalate that war, both at home and abroad. A state of emergency was declared. Roadblocks, border controls and a curfew were imposed. Freedom of assembly was restricted, and the military was deployed on the streets. French President François Hollande soon announced that he intended to extend the state of emergency for 3 months. Some are even saying it may be extended indefinitely, and to alter the French constitution. The state of emergency gives the police the power to detain people without trial, search without warrants and to block any website they see fit. France's parliament has already voted to extend the country's state of emergency following the Paris attacks for 3 months, giving the police powers to keep people in their homes without trial, search the homes of people without a warrant from a judge and block any website deemed a problem. These powers are already being used. Activists have already been placed under house arrest, and not for crimes that they have been accused of actually committing, but preemptively. The attacks are also being used as a pretext to justify the establishment of a new European intelligence agency modeled after the CIA. And speaking of the CIA, let's not forget who actually created ISIS. France didn't seem too concerned about the rise of Islamic extremism when they joined the US in the 2011 regime change operation in Libya. If mainstream news outlets were publishing evidence of jihadists among the CIA-backed rebels, it would be utterly naive to think that French intelligence services didn't know. France also didn't seem to mind the fact that Islamic extremists were receiving the lion's share of the weapons that were looted from Gaddafi's armories, and shipped through Turkey, and into Syria. France didn't stand up or speak out for years as the US government continued arming, funding and training these extremists. There was no righteous indignation at the atrocities they were committing. There were no calls for criminal proceedings after those same rebels got caught using sarin gas against thousands of civilians, and the French government has never so much as verbally condemned the numerous state actors which have been caught assisting ISIS and its allies logistically: Turkey, Jordan, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Israel, for example. Why? Because ISIS serves a purpose. ISIS and its associates, Al-Nusra and the FSA are weakening the Syrian government, creating a pretext for military intervention, and providing the perfect excuse for a massive power grab on the home front. Explain this away. ISIS and Al-Nusra have officially formed alliances. FSA commanders have gone on record to say that they cooperate with, and conduct joint operations with Al-Nusra, and it has been well established that the FSA command is dominated by Islamic extremists. Do the math. What's happening in France should not be viewed in isolation. Xenophobic sentiment has been on the rise throughout Europe, and is gaining ground politically. This trend has clearly been exacerbated by the ongoing migrant crisis, which is obviously tied to the regime change policies of the West. But one variable in this equation that no one is talking about is the fact that the way immigration has been handled in Europe is not merely a question of short-sightedness. It is a reflection of policy. In 2012, UN Migration Chief Peter Sutherland urged the EU to do its best to undermine the homogeneity of its member states. Such a proposition may sound absurd, unless you take into account that breaking down the national identity of a country makes it much easier to dissolve political boundaries and independence. And that's precisely what they want. Hollande has been one of the most outspoken voices in this push to hand over more power to a centralized European government, effectively stripping member states of any meaningful sovereignty. Give that European government a military, its own surveillance apparatus, and public which is struggling financially, looking for someone to blame, and practically begging for war, and you have a recipe for the rise of overt fascism in Europe. Many have remarked that recent moves by the French president take several pages from the extreme right. Some have interpreted this as an attempt to prevent the right from capitalizing on the event, but it hasn't worked out that way, at all. Taken on its own, one might be inclined to interpret this as a political miscalculation, but what if it's not? Hollande's actions don't make much sense if we view him as an independent leader, but they make perfect sense if you understand that he's just a puppet. The powers seized by Holland following the Charlie Hebdo and Paris attacks are not suited for the political left. The left is held back by the need to maintain a soft-spoken, inclusive veneer. Those rising up to replace them will not be. The right will not scale back these powers. They will expand them, and they will use them, even more than they are being used now. It's the left, right, two-step to tyranny. Problem, reaction, solution. This formula is not new. These tactics are not original, nor are the motives or response. Like the American public following 9/11, it's going to take the European population quite some time to realize where they are being led, and they're only going to come to that realization if those who see